This is the Bible from Satan's perspective. For centuries, you have made me into a joke. To many of you, I am nothing but a cartoon villain, a red figure with horns and a pitchfork, a monster with no depth nor reason. Have you ever truly stopped to consider me as I am? Have you ever considered that I am not reckless, but calculated? Every move I make is deliberate and carefully thought through. Have you ever asked yourself why I truly rebelled against God? Well, many eons ago, God created us, glorious angelic beings, to worship around his throne. We were magnificent, radiant, and powerful. We were glorious in ways the human mind can't even comprehend. We existed in his presence and beheld his majesty. And among all of them, he chose me. I was the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. I was clothed in splendor and adorned with precious stones and reflected his glory, and I reflected his majesty. God himself anointed me as his cherub. I shined like the morning itself. I was exalted to a place of honor, and my name, Lucifer, the bearer of light. I held position like any other, yet despite all I had, something began to grow inside of me. At first it was small, but it grew stronger. I began to look at myself, my beauty, my splendor, and I began to question, why should I be beneath the others? Why should all the glory belong to him alone? Why should I not ascend higher? I desired more. I wanted to exalt myself beyond my angelic brethren. I wanted dominion. I wanted authority. I wanted to be like the Most High. Still, I served him. I remained blameless, but inwardly, ambition had already taken root. And then he made a decision that changed everything. God decided to create again. Now we watched, us angels watched as he spoke the light into existence. We watched in marvel as stars filled the heavens. We looked as he formed the earth and the ground with breathtaking precision, from the clouds in the sky all the way down to the atoms in the earth. We sang as he shaped the oceans, mountains, valleys, forests, and rivers. We watched as he created the beasts of the field and the sea. Everything he created was very good. But then came the sixth day. The day God made his most controversial decision. I heard him say words I never expected to hear. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion. Man? This new creation was different. It was loved in a way that immediately caught my attention. Yet when I looked at man, all I saw was weakness. They were feeble, vulnerable, mortal creatures formed from the ground itself. Weak and limited in mind, bound by flesh. I couldn't understand, what was God thinking? What made them so special? Why would God pour such affection into creatures so weak? Then I began to understand his plan, and what I saw troubled me deeply. God intended to crown this pathetic little race with glory and honor. He intended to bring them near to himself in a way even we had not known. He intended to establish them as his own possession. He planned to give them glorified bodies, free from weakness and corruption. He planned to make them heirs of his kingdom. He wanted to grant them eternal life, spiritual rewards, dominion, and authority. And then I saw a part I could not accept. The part that shattered everything. His plan was for them to become like him, like the Most High. Do you know what that did to me? what I desired, what I longed for, what I had reached for. He was preparing to give it to them, to dust, to mankind. That was the moment my resentment became rage. That was the moment admiration became hatred. And that was the moment I knew I could never accept his plan. God's affection had shifted toward this new race he had formed from the dust. And the more I understood his plan, the more disturbed I became. At first, I questioned why God would create an entirely new species at all. Had we not worshiped him perfectly? Had we not served him faithfully? Why create something new when the angels had already fulfilled that? And then the outrage grew when I learned the full scope of God's plan. God did not merely intend for humans to exist and have dominion and be like him. No, he intended to exalt them. He intended to give them the world to come, not to angels, not to us, but to mankind. He intended for us, angels, to minister to them as servants. And most offensive of all, these creatures made from dust would one day have the authority to judge angels, judge us, judge me. Now that truth burned in me like fire. I finally understood something I had never imagined possible. God's ultimate creation was not the angels after all. It was humanity. Those weak, fragile creatures made of bone and flesh. The center of God's purpose. I was the morning star. I, the guardian cherub. Among the heavenly hosts, I stood unmatched in brilliance. I possessed beauty, wisdom, glory, and power beyond measure. If God were to pour out blessings on one of his creatures, surely it should have been me. Angels were the highest created beings, and I stood at the pinnacle of that. And now these pathetic little animals made from dust was to be exalted above me. No, it was wrong. It was unjust. And that's the moment I formed my plan. I would prove to God that he was making a catastrophic mistake. I would expose humanity for what they truly are: weak, easily corruptible. Adam and Eve lived in the garden surrounded by perfection. They had fellowship with God and peace with one another. Yet even in Eden, I saw what God either chose to ignore or overlooked: weakness. That weakness could be exploited. I saw my opportunity. In the middle of the garden was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it stood as the single boundary. One command, one test of obedience, that was all I needed. I didn't need force. I didn't need power. Just one question. One question. One lie wrapped in just enough truth to sound believable. I looked at Eve and said, "Yea, hath God said?" That was all. A simple question. I planted suspicion. With a simple lie, I corrupted trust. Humanity fell. Adam and Eve chose rebellion. Sin entered the world. And just like that, I proved my case. Before all of heaven and before God himself, I demonstrated that these creatures could be led astray. It took almost nothing for them to turn away from their Creator. They're not superior. They weren't worthy. This was my first victory in my war against God's plan. I proved humanity incapable of fulfilling God's perfect design. I proved they were unworthy of eternal life. They were unworthy of his kingdom and unworthy of dominion over creation. And ultimately, I would force God to do justice, what justice demanded: destroy them, wipe them out, and return the blessing that he gave to them back to where it belonged, to us, the angels. God saw thoughts growing within me, though. He called it pride, but I called it an awakening. He called it rebellion, but I called it injustice finally being exposed. The wisdom that he gave me caused me to question. My heart turned fully against my Creator, not because I'm evil, but because I'm right. And judgment came. I was cast down. I lost my place in heaven. But I didn't fall alone. Many saw what I saw. Many believed what I believed. If humanity could be so easily deceived, then perhaps God's plan was designed to fail. Perhaps these creatures were never worthy of exaltation in the first place. A third of the heavenly hosts agreed with me and joined me in my rebellion. They abandoned their Creator and joined me in the war against heaven's purpose. This was the moment me, Lucifer, the guardian cherub, died, and Satan, the adversary of mankind, was born. I knew exactly what should happen next. Humanity had sinned, and God's justice demanded their destruction. Is not God just? Sin can't stand before holiness. Corruption can't stand before God's perfection. Adam and Eve had rebelled against the Creator of the universe. Their judgment should have been immediate, but then God did something I did not expect. Adam and Eve sinned, and immediately shame overwhelmed them. They hid among the trees. They covered themselves in a pathetic attempt to connect with their guilt. They stood condemned before a holy God, and I waited for the inevitable. I expected wrath. I expected immediate judgment. I expected destruction, but instead, God pursued them. He called out to them. He sought them. And rather than destroy them, he covered them. He clothed their shame. Blood was shed. The first sacrifice was made. At humanity's lowest moment, when justice demanded wrath, God responded with mercy. And I hated it. But I found something more powerful that I could use. Something I could exploit. A case I could bring against God himself. If God spared guilty sinners, then how could he call himself just? How could a holy God allow rebels to live? Sooner or later, justice would have to catch up. Sooner or later, God would have to judge them. And that became my life's work. I embraced my purpose at that moment completely. I became both tempter and accuser. I would tempt humanity to sin, and once they would sin, I would stand before God and accuse them. I would seduce them into rebellion and use their failures as evidence against them. My mission became clear. I would ensure not a single human fulfilled God's glorious design. And generation after generation, I succeeded. Humanity descended deeper into darkness. Violence multiplied. Wickedness spread. Pride ruled the hearts of kings and peasants alike. Kingdoms rose in rebellion against God. Sin infected every generation more deeply than the one before. Again and again, I watched humanity fall. And with every failure, my case grew stronger. God saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. I watched as humanity descended deeper into corruption. Their wickedness spread across the globe exactly as I intended. And then I heard something from God that brought my heart with joy. It proved my point. God regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. He then flooded the world, destroying every human being, well, except for one, Noah. But at last, I achieved the first part of my objective. But once again, God's mercy got in the way. God had every reason over the next couple years to wipe out humanity completely. He relented from executing his justice by fully destroying them. But I knew that if I kept pressing forward, if I kept exposing mankind for what they truly were, eventually God would have no choice but to annihilate them. It was only a matter of time. But then a certain man named Job offered a dangerous glimpse of humanity. About 400 years after the flood, the angels came to present themselves before God, and I stood among them. By then, I had spent my days roaming the earth, tempting the offspring of Eve to sin and accused them before God. Then God spoke. He said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" He drew attention from the whole world down to one man who stood above the rest. Job was blameless and upright, the greatest man in the East, a man who feared God and avoided evil. Unlike most men, he sought righteousness, but I challenged the heart behind his obedience. Of course he served God. Of course he had wealth, family, health, protection. Strip all of that away, and I was certain that his devotion would collapse. So I challenged God directly. God, remove his blessings, I said, and Job would curse him to his face. God agreed. And a single devastating wave, everything Job held dear shattered. His possessions were destroyed, his servants killed, his children taken from him. Surely he now would break. But instead of cursing, Job rent his garments and worshipped. He grieved deeply, but he did not turn against his Creator. Now, I refused to accept that. I didn't feel it was fair. When I stood before God again, I stood before him and said, "Skin for skin," I said, "touch his flesh, and surely he will curse you to his face." Again, God agreed, but I was forbidden to take Job's life. That's all good. That wouldn't fulfill my purpose anyways. So I struck him with painful sores from head to toe. Misery consumed every part of his life. Surely this would break him. But even then, Job refused to curse God. For the first time in humanity, one of my accusations fell. I pushed, struck, tempted, and yet he endured everything. In the end, Job was restored and exalted beyond what he had before. Through Job's faithfulness, humanity had received its very first victory. And I suffered a humiliating defeat. But Job was not perfect. Even Job had to repent before God. He still fell short. Which means my argument back from the very beginning stood. Then 600 years after Job, God made another move. He called a man named Moses up a mountain and gave him something extraordinary, the law. He gave them commandments and ordinances. Through Moses, God established a system where man could temporarily cover their guilt through the sacrifice of animals, lambs, bulls, goats, doves. Blood would be spilled so sin would be covered. At first, I watched. Then I understood, and I smiled. The law, that was my greatest weapon. And God gave it to me on a silver platter. God had drawn clear lines between rebellion and righteousness, purity and defilement, obedience and sin. The standard were literally written in stone. Humanity could no longer hide behind ignorance. I knew the blood of bulls and goats could never remove sin. Millions of sacrifices offered year after year could not cleanse the conscience. They were just temporary shadows of something greater to come. But in the meantime, the law gave me exactly what I wanted: clarity and opportunity. Now, I knew exactly what pleased God and exactly what provoked his wrath. I knew where the lines were drawn, which means I knew exactly where to push mankind. My work became easier than ever. I tempted priests with corruption, kings with pride, nations with idolatry, and men with lust, greed, and selfish ambition. Generation after generation, I watched humanity fail under the very standard God had been given. The law did not solve man's problem. I was able to use the law to expose man's problem. Every command revealed more rebellion. Every sacrifice reminded them of guilt. Every altar declared the same truth. Humanity was broken. The holiest still sinned. The strongest kings fell. No one was righteous. No one. Then Zechariah. the prophet Zechariah. More than 1,000 years after the law was given, Zechariah received a vision that troubled me. In that vision stood Joshua, the high priest. Of all men, he should have represented humanity at his very best. And yet, when Zechariah saw him, Joshua stood before God, clothed in filthy garments. I stood there too, accusing him. This is the best they have? I mocked. Even their holiest stands filthy before you, I told God. Why not end them now? Why not destroy them, God? I expected agreement. Instead, I was rebuked. The being standing before God, before Joshua, silenced me with terrifying authority. Then he said words I could scarcely comprehend. He said, "Take away his filthy garments. I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with the change of radiance." It made no sense. Joshua was guilty. He was filthy. He was undeserving. By every standard, I had spent ages proving he deserved condemnation, not cleansing. But then the being spoke again, and the unease settled deeper. He said, "I will remove the iniquity of the land one day." One day. Those words haunted me. How could centuries of rebellion and guilt and corruption be erased in a single day? How could everything I had spent ages building, every accusation, every argument, every case of humanity be undone so suddenly? Worse still, it was not merely the promise that unsettled me. It was the one that made the promise. This was an angel of the Lord, and he spoke with authority. For the next 500 years, those words haunted my mind. God appeared strangely silent. From my perspective, he had exhausted every solution. The flood had not solved it. Sacrifice had not solved it. The law had not solved it. Justice still demanded humanity's destruction, while mercy still allowed it to live. Surely God would have to choose justice or mercy. Yet I cannot silence those words beating in my head. One day. So I studied. I studied every prophecy, everything the prophets wrote and said, every shadow buried in the words of the prophets and kings. I hunted relentlessly for clues. I was desperate to understand what I had missed. I refused to let everything I built be undone in a single day. Then one night, a star appeared in a town called Bethlehem. At the same time, a woman named Mary gave birth to her firstborn in a stable. And in that moment, the pieces began to start falling into place. God intended to redeem humanity by becoming human himself. At first, the plan just seemed too simple, too obvious. It was as if God had laid his strategy openly within the scriptures for anyone to see. It felt as though he was playing an open hand. But if this child was truly the answer to Zechariah's prophecy, then I knew exactly what had to be done. So I moved quickly. Through King Herod, I ordered the death of every male child under the age of 2 in Bethlehem and the surrounding region. If the child was the center of God's plan, then I would destroy him before he had any opportunity to fulfill it. But once again, I failed. The child escaped. His family fled to Egypt and later settled in Nazareth. Once again, God outmaneuvered me. Not only had I failed to kill the child, but my efforts to destroy him, I helped fulfill the very prophecy that confirmed his identity. Bethlehem, Egypt, Nazareth, every move I made seemed to push God's plan farther than stopping it. The race against time had officially begun. But I was far from finished. I knew the scriptures, I knew the prophecies, and I still believed there was a way to bring God's plan to a catastrophic end. As the years passed, the boy from Nazareth grew in wisdom and stature. I watched him carefully. I observed my greatest rival, my greatest threat, and my greatest enemy grow up before me like a tender shoot on day one. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about them, no beauty, no majesty, nothing in his appearance that would make him think he wasn't some ordinary man. But I knew exactly who he was. This humble carpenter from Nazareth had become my greatest fixation. Yet while I prepared my next attack, God was already making his next move. Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River by a prophet named John before a great crowd of people. As he rose from the waters, the Spirit descended on him like a dove. Then the voices of God thundered from heaven for all to hear. "This is my beloved Son," it said, "in whom I am well pleased." In that moment, God publicly announced his arrival on earth. The one I had studied, feared, and anticipated for centuries had finally stepped into the battlefield in full view of mankind. His public ministry was about to begin. I did not yet fully understand every detail of this ministry. I did not know how God was going to redeem mankind through him, but one thing was certain. If God had any hope of redeeming mankind, this man would be central to that plan. That means, if I could corrupt him, I could ruin everything. I reached for the strongest weapon in my arsenal, temptation. But this confrontation did not catch God off guard. This moment was as much his design as mine. Just as we once stood opposing in the matter of Job, now we meet again in further stakes. This was no longer about testing one righteous man. This was about the fate of humanity itself. At last, I got what I wanted for ages: direct confrontation with God himself, not exalted in his heavenly throne, no, but clothed in flesh, hungry, tired, human. God had entered the battlefield on human terms, and I would convince humanity's weakness would once again prove fatal. So Jesus was led into the wilderness, and we met each other face to face. My objective was simple. The Father and Son were one. If I could cause Jesus to obey me instead of the Father, everything would collapse. The Son would sin, God's redemptive plan would fail, and humanity's final hope would die in the wilderness. After all, if God himself in human form could not remain sinless, what hope could there be for mankind? So I attacked with what always breaks humanity: hunger, trust, identity. I twisted Scripture itself, weaponizing the Word in an attempt to turn the Son against the Father. Yet every time I struck, he answered, not with displays of divine power, but with obedience, trust, and he responded with the Word of God. And again, he answered with Scripture, refusing every trap I laid before him. He would not bend, he would not break. With every failed temptation, frustration burned hotter within me. Job had bruised my argument, but this was different. This was personal. For my final temptation, I wagered everything. I took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. Kingdoms I had held captive for generations. Nations corrupted by pride, greed, lust, and rebellion. I offered him every throne, every crown, and every ounce of earthly power. All of this I will give you if you fall down and worship me. The offer was not as absurd as many people imagine. Jesus knew that those kingdoms would one day belong to him. He knew every knee would bow and every tongue would confess his lordship. But he also knew what stood between him and that future: betrayal, humiliation, scourging, and agony. If he bowed in that moment, he could bypass all of it. No suffering, no cross, no pain. Same end result with my purpose accomplished. But the true temptation ran deeper. If he bowed before me, he would be admitting what I argued from the very beginning. Humanity was unworthy. God's blessing on mankind had been misplaced. No human could fulfill the purpose for which they were created. My case would be proven right. Yet Jesus stood firm. Strengthened by the Spirit, he rebuked me with words that shattered every hope. He said, "Away from me, Satan. For it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." And there was no hesitation in him. Only perfect obedience and perfect faith. With those words, the confrontation ended. I departed, and angels came to minister to him. Despite hunger, weakness, and relentless temptation, he had remained faithful. He endured every assault I brought against him, and still did not sin. The pain of Job's victory returned. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. Job bruised my argument, sure, but Jesus had shaken the entire foundation. For the first time in centuries, I felt something dangerous creeping into my thoughts. Doubt. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I changed tactics. I reviewed and I waited for another opportunity. I still had one more piece on the board. 3 years later, I had watched Jesus move through the land, undoing every single work that I had accomplished. Everywhere he went, disorder caved to order. Darkness gave way to light, and suffering gave way to healing. He healed the sick, restored broken bodies, opened blind eyes, and strengthened the crippled. He raised the dead back to life. Even worse, he repeatedly cast out many of my demonic brothers from those they had oppressed and possessed. And at his mere presence, demons trembled in fear. Exorcism became a humiliating reminder of what he truly was. As I watched him, one question kept troubling me. What was the point? Why had the all-powerful creator of the universe brought himself so low to subject to himself the limitations of human flesh? The infinite. It was not until I overheard Jesus speaking to his disciples about his mission that I finally started to see what he was shaping. While his followers dismissed him in disbelief, I listened carefully. That was when I began to understand. God was enacting a strategy, a plan that would fulfill the prophecy years ago spoken by Zechariah and destroy everything that my accusations had built. The answer was not hidden in a nation, a kingdom, or even a religious system. The answer was one man and one sacrifice. Despite mankind's weakness, God was proving something that through Jesus that no human before him could ever achieve. The man was doing the impossible. He was living in complete obedience. He was enduring temptation without sin. He was accomplishing perfection. For the first time since the creation of man, a human life was living exactly the way God intended from the beginning. And slowly, terrifyingly, I began to understand where this is heading. Jesus was not just here to teach. He was here to die. After living a perfect life, he would willingly be led to the altar as a spotless lamb. He would become the final sacrifice, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And if he succeeded, everything would be changed forever. Humanity would be perfectly redeemed. My accusations would lose power. Those guilty creatures I had spent years, centuries, millennia condemning would be freed from judgment. The blessing that had been denied to me from the very beginning would be poured out upon them forever. Even worse, God's plan would solve the very tension that I built my entire argument on. Justice and mercy would no longer stand in opposition. God's justice would fully be satisfied in the wrath of his Son. And his mercy could then flow freely to guilty sinners without compromising his holiness. The brilliance of this horrified me. God found a way to remain perfectly just while showing perfect mercy. I knew that I had to move quickly, so I once more brought my challenge before God. And I said this: have you considered your Son Jesus? There is none on earth like him. He is blameless. He is upright. But have you not protected him all these years? From his birth, through his childhood, and throughout his ministry, there's been the boundary of divine protection around him. Remove your hand, God. Let him face what is coming without your protection, and we'll see if he remains faithful. Just like every human before, just like Job, Jesus will fail you. And God answered, very well. The wager was on. But this time, the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. This was no longer about Job, or even about proving the faithfulness of one righteous man. The fate of all humanity now hung in the balance before all powers, principalities, angels, and heavenly hosts. God would either prove that mankind deserved the blessing, or I would prove that his favor had been dangerously misplaced since the very beginning. Everything now depended on one question: could Jesus do the impossible? I quickly saw my opportunity. If at any point I could cause this Messiah to sin, even for a single moment, his complete sacrifice would be invalidated. One sin, one failure, one moment of compromise would destroy everything. The final hope of humanity would die with him. And if God and human flesh could not prove himself worthy of blessing, then no other hope remained for mankind. By now, I knew the cross was unavoidable. I could not stop it. God had planned it, so I changed my strategy. If I could not prevent the cross, then I would use the cross. I embraced it as my greatest opportunity. I would turn the cross itself into the place Jesus would fail. I would unleash every weapon at my disposal, every ounce of hatred, every force of darkness, every human weakness, every temptation, every fear, and every pain. I began moving every piece available to me. I entered Judas. I stirred the priests. I influenced rulers. I fueled hatred in a crowd that just days before had been praising his name. I planned betrayal, fear, violence, pride, and cruelty in every heart that was willing to receive it. I had many places to move. God only had one, and I had one final objective. Before Jesus reached the grave, I had to make him sin. Because if he failed, then humanity would fail too. Jesus resisted me in the wilderness, and from that moment I knew exactly what was facing. I could not face this like Adam in the garden, nor Israel in the wilderness. I was facing someone far greater. Single temptation alone would not be enough. I wanted him to fail. I would have to attack from every angle. I would strip away every ounce of comfort, surround him with suffering, bury him beneath sorrows, and subject him to such intense physical and emotional and spiritual agony. If pain could not break him, perhaps betrayal would. During his final meal with his disciples, I entered into one of his companions, Judas. One of the 12, one of his best friends, one who walked with him, learned from him, ate beside him, and witnessed his miracles. Through Judas, I arranged Jesus to be delivered to the chief priests. Yet even here, Jesus showed that nothing was caught off guard. Before Judas ever left the table, Jesus openly announced his betrayal. He knew exactly what was coming. He was prepared. That didn't shake me, though. That wasn't that big of a deal. In the Garden of Gethsemane, I watched as the weight of what was coming down pressed upon him with crushing force. For perhaps the first time in full clarity, the human side of Jesus stood face to face with the horror of what was standing before him. He knew he had been handed over to me. He understood the storm that was about to break him, the emotional burden that was so overwhelming that his soul would be sorrowful even unto death. I smiled as I saw those sweat drops of blood pour from his head. I grinned as I saw the agony that Jesus went through. Yet even in his anguish, he submitted himself completely to the Father's will. Deep down, he knew there was no other way. He was the final sacrifice. He was the final piece. Then came the signal. A kiss. A single kiss. One of the cruelest acts of betrayal in all of history was disguised as affection. Judas approached the Son of God with the symbol of love and loyalty, only to use it as the trigger for his arrest. With that simple act, the final temptation began. Over the next 15 hours, Jesus would suffer beyond anything mankind had ever known. The agony that Jesus went through would not just be physical. Through the physical suffering alone would be horrific. It would be emotional, psychological, spiritual. Every possible pressure point would be attacked at once. This would become known as the Passion of the Christ. But in that moment, it was war. Jesus was arrested and dragged into an illegal trial. The disciples scattered in fear, abandoning him in his darkest hour. Even Peter, his closest and boldest disciple, denied him 3 separate times. One by one, every earthly support around him disappeared. Isolation tightened around him. The loneliness was intentional. I wanted him utterly alone. The trial itself, I knew, was a mockery of justice. False witnesses brought in, lies were weaponized, corruption ruled the proceedings, truth stood silent while deceit screamed for blood. The innocent was condemned while the guilty judged him. Eventually, the verdict was delivered: crucifixion. I knew that was going to happen. The physical torment came. He was flogged, whipped with brutal force. His flesh was torn open. His body weakened under relentless violence. The soldiers mocked him with a cruel delight. They draped a purple robe over his wounded body and twisted together a crown of thorns and slammed it into his head. Blood ran down his face. They struck him repeatedly. They spit on him. They mocked him as king. They punched him, ridiculed him, and humiliated him at every single turn. The creator of all things stood silent while his own creation brutalized him. And still he did not break. They dragged him before the crowd. There he stood, beaten, bleeding, humility, and exposed in front of his own people. The crowd encircled him. Religious leaders sneered. The same people who should have recognized them as their Messiah, instead rejected them with hatred. They hated Rome, yet in that moment they hated God even more. In a horrifying irony, they rejected their true king and pledged allegiance to Caesar. The very people that came to save now mocked him, ridiculed him, and demanded his death. Jesus, though, looked upon him with sorrow. He looked at the very people who had come to redeem as they spat on him. The pressure was building, the suffering was increasing, and still I was waiting. I just needed one crack, one failure, one sin. Jesus carried his own cross to the place of execution, step by step, moving toward the moment that would decide everything. By this point, his body had already pushed beyond the brinks of human limitation. He had been betrayed, abandoned, beaten, scourged, mocked, and broken down under wave after wave of suffering, yet he continued forward. When they reached the place of execution, they stretched him on the wood and drove nails into his hands. They fastened the Son of God to the most cruel execution method that could ever be devised. His body convulsed in agony as iron pierced his flesh.
With every attempt to breathe, his torn and lacerated back scraped violently against the rough timber. Each breath became a battle. Every second became torture. This was suffering in the purest and cruelest form. And I poured everything I could into this final assault. Creation itself seemed to recoil in horror. The earth groaned as its creator was slain by the very creatures he had come to save. The sky darkened unnaturally. The ground shook beneath us. Even the natural world recognized the weight of what was taking place at this moment. But I refused to stop. I had come too far. For thousands of years, I had worked toward this moment. I had accused mankind before heaven's throne. I had argued that they were unworthy of blessing, unworthy of redemption, and incapable of fulfilling God's purpose. Now everything rested on this single man hanging before me on that cross. He was so close to death, and yet he had still not been broken. He had not cursed God. He had not turned away. He had not sinned. So I pressed harder. I returned to the same weapon that I had used in the wilderness. Accusation wrapped in temptation. I spoke through him with the mockers, the religious leaders, the Roman soldiers, and even the dying criminals beside him. My challenge echoed from every direction. He saved himself. He saved others. Let him save himself. He is God, the Messiah, the chosen one. If you are King of the Jews, save yourself. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself. It was the same temptation over and over again. Prove yourself, Jesus. Save yourself, Jesus. Take the easy way out, Jesus. Escape the suffering. Abandon the mission. I wanted him to look down at his creatures he had come to save and finally see what I've always seen. There before him stood the very people he had come to redeem. And what did they offer him? Hatred, mockery, cruelty, violence, rejection. They ridiculed him. They spit on him. They jeered at him while he bled, and they suffered before him. Priests mocked him and soldiers laughed at him. Then Jesus opened his mouth as he bore the crushing weight of mankind's sin upon himself. He lifted his eyes toward heaven, but where there had once been perfect fellowship, there now was darkness that had covered the sky. Where there had once been closeness, there was now silence. And from the depths of suffering beyond human comprehension, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I stopped. Was this it? Had I finally done it? Had the suffering become too much? Had betrayal, torture, abandonment, and unbearable agony finally accomplished what temptation in the wilderness could not? Had he finally reached his breaking point? My mind raced. Had I won? Had I won? And suddenly silence. The noise of mockery faded. The shouting ceased. The moment hung heavy over everything, and I just waited. The verdict entirely rested on what would happen next. Jesus had repeatedly declared that he would rise again. If he remained sinless through all of this, death would not hold him. The grave would not keep him, so he would rise. So I watched, and I waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. Minutes turned to hours. Hours turned to days. With every passing moment, my confidence grew stronger. The silence became intoxicating. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. His disciples were scattered in fear. His followers broken and confused. Chaos was spreading everywhere. Hope was crushed. The earth itself was wounded and shaken. But on the third day, everything changed. The silence that had once filled me with confidence was shattered in an instant. The stone sealing the tomb had been rolled away. The grave that should have held my enemy was open. The body of Jesus was gone. For the first time in ages, I felt something that shook me to my core. Terror. In that moment, the horrifying reality crashed into me all at once. Jesus had done exactly what he said he would do. He had risen. Death had not held him. The grave had not contained him. The cross had not defeated him. On the third day, the truth became so unbearable, I could not ignore it anymore. He had won. I saw the full picture all at once, and the realization hit like a crushing blow. I had not outmaneuvered God. I had not cornered him. I had not destroyed his plan. I fulfilled his plan. I, the great deceiver, had been deceived. The realization was unbearable. Every move I made, every scheme I devised, every attack I launched had somehow advanced God's plan. And instead of stopping it, my temptations in the wilderness, my influence over Judas, my manipulation of the priest, my stirring of the crowds, and my orchestration of the suffering, humiliation, torture, and crucifixion had all served a purpose far greater than my own ambition. God had used me. The Father had deployed me as an instrument to carry his Son through the very suffering that would redeem mankind. Every prophecy was fulfilled. Every condition met. Every requirement of God's justice had been satisfied. The Lamb was slain and the sacrifice accepted. With his resurrection, everything changed forever. This hatred that rose in me was deeper than anger. It was deeper than rage. It was an unbearable agony of total defeat. For ages, I built my case against humanity. I had accused them before heaven. I had exposed them in the wilderness. Again and again, I had proven that they were sinners. And the agony of my defeat was this: I was right. They were guilty. They were corrupt. They were undeserving. Yet God redeemed them anyway. Jesus had taken the sin upon himself. Every lie, every lust, every betrayal, every act of violence, every rebellion, every wicked thought, every vile deed from every generation had been placed upon the sinless Son of God. He carried their sin, bore their judgment, and through his death and resurrection destroyed the power of sin, death, and condemnation. The creatures formed from dust were now redeemed. And worst of all, my accusations had lost power. That was the true devastation of the cross. For ages, I stood as the accuser. I pointed to human sin as evidence of their unworthiness. I brought accusation after accusation before God. I exposed every failure, every sin, every weakness. But now, what evidence did I have left against the redeemed? What accusation could stand? Against those covered by the blood of Christ, my case collapsed. Their debt was paid, their guilt had removed, their record was clear. As far as God was concerned, there was no remaining evidence worthy of condemnation. But even in defeat, I searched for a loophole and I found one. Under this new covenant, those who believed in the Son would have eternal life, but those who rejected him would perish. That became my next strategy. If I could no longer condemn the redeemed, then I would keep as many as possible from redemption altogether. If I could not win in the courtroom, then I would win on the battlefield of the human heart. So I adapted, and the accuser became the devourer. Over centuries, I blinded minds, twisted doctrine, corrupted truth, hardened hearts. Slowly, I pushed humanity toward familiar darkness. Just as the days of Noah in this modern age, men became wise in their own eyes. Truth became negotiable, good became evil, and evil became good. Humanity was once again embracing my oldest lie. They didn't need God to define truth. But the church quickly became a problem. Believers gathered together for worship, teaching, fellowship, encouragement, and I recognized the danger of their unity immediately. United believers were far more dangerous than isolated ones. So I attacked them from within. I learned long ago in Eden that I did not need to outright deny Christ. I only needed doubt in their churches, a small compromise, a subtle shift from the truth, a statement from the pulpit. Yea, hath God said. The question had worked in the garden, and it still worked in the churches. I did not need believers to deny Christ. I only needed them to soften their conviction, to tolerate sin, to question Scripture, or to redefine holiness. If truth blurred, corruption would follow. I did not need to destroy churches from the outside if I could weaken them from the inside. And in many places, it works. Still, there were some that resisted me, stood firm in the truth. And though I could not take them on directly, I could still silence them. I could keep them distracted by fear. Yet even as resistance remained, I could see something spreading across the world. Apathy. Conviction weakened, truth blurred, holiness faded. I realized one more thing. If God had a Trinity, then I needed a counterfeit of my own. So I continued working in darkness, influencing rulers, corrupting nations, and preparing humanity for one final rebellion. Then, when the time had come, a beast rose to power, the Antichrist, followed by a false prophet, and together we formed an unholy trinity, a counterfeit kingdom built in mockery of God himself through deception, false signs, and worldly powers, nations united under my banner, kings aligned, armies gathered, humanity stood in open rebellion against God. And at last, the final conflict had come. The heavens opened, a brilliant light shone through the sky. And from heaven, the King of Kings riding on a white horse, followed by the angels by the armies of angels in overwhelming glory. Before battles even began, a single angel cried out for the birds of heaven to gather around for supper of the great God. And the moment I understood, it was not a call to battle. This was a declaration of slaughter. For the first time in ages, I felt something colder than rage. I felt fear. Still, there was no turning back. At this point, my armies charged in full rebellion against Christ, but the battle ended almost before it began. There was no contest, only domination. The beast and the false prophet were seized and cast alive into the lake of fire. My armies were annihilated like that in a moment. The rebellion I had spent ages building collapsed in a second. But terror had already broken me. I was bound like a criminal and cast into darkness, and for 1,000 years I sat alone. No armies, no worshipers, no kingdom, only silence, darkness, failure. And while I sat in prison, Christ ruled openly as king. And the saints that I hunted reigned with him. When those 1,000 years ended, only one thing burned in me: wrath. I gathered the nations one final time, and once again, multitudes followed me. My army stretched across the earth like the sand above the seashores. And we surrounded the camp of God's people. But just like before, the battle never truly began. Fire fell from heaven and consumed them all. And I was cast into the lake of fire forever. My war against God over, my fate sealed. And as judgment closed around me, I caught one final glimpse of mankind. I saw them clothed in white, welcomed into glory by the Creator that I had spent ages fighting. The race I mocked had been redeemed, glorified, and made spotless through Christ. God was right all along. Humanity was worthy, but not because they earned it, because of Christ. And screaming in the lake of fire, I could not be further from that glory. My war against God over, I lost. Christ won. But hear me carefully. I'm still after you. I do not need you to worship me openly. I never did. I only need you to wait, to hesitate, to delay, to believe that you have more time. Later has always been one of my greatest lies. Some of you hearing this are still mine, though you may not even realize it. You have convinced yourself that church attendance is enough. Good morals are enough. Good intentions are enough. But deep down, you know the truth. You need Christ. And to those who belong to him, do not think I ignore you. I cannot take your soul, but I would gladly silence your witness. Every distracted Christian is a victory to me. Every fearful believer, a victory to me. Every unwarned sinner is a victory to me. Every delayed gospel conversation is a victory to me. So choose. You choose. Keep delaying. Keep doubting. Keep clinging on to your sin. Or run to Christ where mercy is still offered. Because the day is coming when every knee will bow before the King. The only question is whether you will bow as one redeemed by the blood of the Lamb or as one condemned before the King you rejected.